When you and the narcissist both stop reaching out, the silence does not bring peace. Instead, it triggers a psychological chain reaction. In that moment, control begins to shift, and for the first time, it is no longer in their hands. Many people assume that when communication ends on both sides, the story is finished. But the reality is far more complicated. This is often the point where the narcissist's internal struggle truly begins, while your own healing quietly takes root. Stay with me, because what unfolds next is the part most people never see. If this feels painfully familiar, keep listening. Understanding what is happening beneath the surface is one of the most powerful ways to finally break free from the cycle for good. The first stage that unfolds on their side is something like a psychological recalibration. It is subtle, almost invisible, and it happens long before they decide whether to contact you again. While you experience your silence as a boundary, an act of self-preservation, or the first real step toward recovery, they process it in a completely different way. They do not see your silence as something to respect. They treat it as information that needs to be analyzed. Instead of asking themselves how they hurt you, they focus on figuring out why they no longer have the same influence over you. Their attention turns towards solving the mystery of your behavior rather than understanding the damage they caused. Rather than reflecting with genuine accountability, they begin searching for explanations that protect their own ego. They wonder if you're trying to punish them, if someone else has replaced them, or if this is some kind of test. Every possibility is examined except the one that requires honest self-awareness. Uncertainty makes them deeply uncomfortable because it removes the sense of control they have relied on for so long. Your silence becomes a question they feel compelled to answer, not because they care about your emotional well-being, but because they cannot tolerate not knowing where they stand. During this period, they may not contact you at all. Their silence should never be mistaken for acceptance or emotional maturity. More often, it is a calculated pause. They may quietly monitor your social media, pay attention to mutual acquaintances, or look for any clue that reveals what you are thinking or feeling. From their perspective, they are collecting information and waiting for an opening. Narcissists often believe that people they once influenced will eventually return. Because of that belief, they rarely interpret your silence as final. Instead, they convince themselves it is temporary resistance and assume that sooner or later, you will reach out just as you may have done in the past. They depend on the emotional habits they created within the relationship. They expect guilt to pull you back. They expect your discomfort with conflict to weaken your resolve. They expect your hope that things might improve to outweigh your need for peace. In their mind, those patterns are reliable. But when the silence continues and you do not return, their confidence begins to crack. They slowly realize that something has changed. The influence they once took for granted no longer feels secure. That is when your silence transforms from a temporary inconvenience into something that genuinely threatens their sense of control. For them, silence is never emotionally neutral. It either represents an opportunity to regain dominance or a warning that they may be losing it. The longer you remain consistent, the more unstable their familiar power dynamic becomes. Every day without your reaction quietly challenges the version of reality they depended upon. The emotional experience, however, is completely different for you. While they are trying to understand why their usual methods are no longer working, you are carrying the emotional aftermath of everything that happened. You are sorting through betrayal, confusion, broken trust, unanswered questions, and the exhaustion that comes from living in constant emotional instability. Sadness, grief, loneliness, guilt, and uncertainty often become part of your daily reality. You are not only grieving the relationship itself, you are also grieving the version of yourself that accepted far less than you deserved. Your silence usually comes after reaching a breaking point. Your mind and body simply cannot absorb any more emotional chaos. What looks like distance from the outside is often an act of survival on the inside. You are trying to recover your identity, your self-respect, and your sense of emotional safety. That process is not easy. It affects your sleep, your confidence, your memories, and even the way you see yourself. Healing requires you to confront emotions you may have ignored for a very long time. The narcissist, on the other hand, rarely experiences the silence through that same emotional lens. They generally do not spend their time deeply reflecting on the relationship or considering the pain they caused. Their first reaction is usually centered around disruption rather than heartbreak. They were accustomed to having constant access to your attention, your reassurance, your emotional reactions, your apologies, your care, and even your frustration. Every interaction reinforced their sense of importance. When that source suddenly disappears, they notice the interruption immediately. The absence of that validation often feels less like losing a meaningful relationship and more like losing access to something they had come to expect. The interruption creates irritation because it disrupts the comfort of having your emotional availability whenever they wanted it. Instead of asking why you finally walked away, they often focus on why their usual influence no longer produces the same response. The silence challenges their expectations, not necessarily their emotional attachment. This creates two completely different psychological realities. While you are working through grief, rebuilding your confidence, and learning how to reclaim your life, they are evaluating how your absence affects their ability to maintain control. You are processing emotional loss. They are processing restricted access. You feel the emptiness left behind by the relationship, while they notice the disappearance of a familiar source of validation. As more time passes, this contrast becomes impossible to ignore. You gradually begin to recognize just how much emotional energy you spent trying to maintain the relationship. You start seeing how often you ignored your own needs just to avoid conflict or keep the peace. At the same time, they become increasingly aware that the methods which once worked so effortlessly are no longer producing results. Your emotional availability is no longer automatic. Your silence has changed the balance. While your quiet pushes you further toward self-awareness, personal growth, and healing, it often pushes them toward frustration, entitlement, and a growing awareness that their influence is weakening. The emotional burden you carry is real because it comes from genuine attachment and loss. The discomfort they experience is often connected less to losing you as a person and more to losing the easy access they once had to your attention and compliance. For the narcissist, mutual silence is rarely interpreted as two people taking space to heal. Instead, they often experience it as a direct challenge to their identity. Someone they believed they controlled is no longer responding, and that feels like defiance. They tend to view relationships through the lens of power rather than mutual respect. So when you stop reacting, stop explaining yourself, and stop providing emotional fuel, you disrupt the hierarchy they believed was firmly in place. Even if your only goal is to protect your peace, regain emotional clarity, or finally move forward, they may see your silence as resistance. Arguments never threatened them in the same way because conflict still kept them at the center of your attention. Anger, frustration, and emotional reactions all confirmed that they still occupied space in your emotional world. Silence is different. Silence quietly removes them from that position, and that absence becomes far more unsettling than any confrontation ever could. Without your reactions, they are forced to face an uncomfortable possibility that their importance may not be as permanent as they believed. Because they struggle with uncertainty, your silence creates a space they cannot easily predict or control. Rather than recognizing it as a healthy boundary, they may convince themselves that you are playing games, trying to manipulate them, or deliberately attempting to provoke a response. Their own mindset often prevents them from accepting that your silence is simply the result of emotional exhaustion and a decision to protect yourself. Instead, they begin viewing the situation as a competition, believing they now need to regain the upper hand rather than accept that your life is finally moving forward without them. When the silence continues, many narcissists begin treating it like a contest they are determined to win. Others convince themselves they have been betrayed, telling themselves that you abandoned them. It does not matter if they spent months or even years hurting you. They will often rewrite the meaning of your silence because protecting their self-image feels far more important than honestly understanding your experience. As this inner conflict grows, their confidence begins to crack. Your silence becomes an uncomfortable reflection of their own insecurity. Instead of facing that discomfort, they create stories that restore their sense of superiority. They may convince themselves that you will eventually come back because you always have before. Or they may begin planning ways to make you suffer emotionally for refusing to play the role they expected. In their mind, your silence threatens something they struggle to accept. It suggests that you may no longer be under their psychological influence. When communication stops completely, the emotional experience is very different for each of you. For you, the silence can slowly become a place to breathe, think clearly, and begin making sense of everything you endured. For the narcissist, however, your absence creates a psychological void that forces them towards something they have spent years avoiding. It confronts them with the possibility of losing control. They rarely see the situation as two people choosing distance or respecting boundaries. Instead, they experience your withdrawal as a crack in the system they relied on to maintain their identity. Their self-worth is often built around external validation rather than a stable inner foundation. The attention, reactions, and emotional energy of the people around them become part of how they define themselves. Because you were once a major source of that validation, your refusal to participate shakes the structure they depended on. As days turn into weeks, what first seemed like a temporary inconvenience begins to feel much more threatening to them. Even if they hide it behind anger, arrogance, or complete indifference, anxiety often starts building beneath the surface. The familiar tactics they relied on suddenly stop producing results. Guilt no longer reaches you. Silent treatment no longer makes you chase them. Subtle insults no longer provoke emotional reactions. The cycle they counted on begins breaking apart because there is no longer anyone feeding it. That missing feedback creates growing internal frustration. In healthy relationships, periods of silence can create opportunities for reflection, accountability, and emotional growth. Within a narcissistic dynamic, however, silence often strips away the constant validation they depended on. Without someone continually reflecting attention back toward them, they are left facing emotions they usually work hard to avoid. Rather than sitting with those feelings, they often search for someone else to blame. They may convince themselves that you are the cruel one, that you are intentionally playing games, or that you never genuinely cared. By casting themselves as the victim, they preserve the version of reality that protects their ego. This is also why some narcissists begin rewriting the story for other people. They may present themselves as the one who was mistreated while portraying you as cold, selfish, or emotionally abusive. Their version of events conveniently leaves out the manipulation, disrespect, or emotional harm that led to your silence in the first place. These attempts to damage your reputation often have another purpose as well. They hope the pressure will force you to defend yourself. They want a reaction because any emotional response reassures them that they still have influence over you. If you refuse to participate, something important happens. Every moment you remain calm and refuse to engage weakens the control they once believed they had. While they continue searching for ways to regain influence or replace the validation they lost, you are quietly rebuilding yourself. What first felt like painful silence slowly becomes a place of peace. Instead of being trapped inside their emotional chaos, you begin creating a life that no longer revolves around their approval or their behavior. Your emotions, your apologies, your willingness to explain yourself, and your habit of returning after every conflict all once served a purpose within the relationship. Those responses reinforce their belief that they remained in control. The moment you stop providing those predictable reactions, the entire pattern is interrupted. That interruption forces them into an uncomfortable psychological reality. It exposes how much they depended on your engagement, something they would rarely admit, even to themselves. For a long time, they convinced themselves they were always the one directing the relationship. They believed they controlled the pace, the emotional climate, and the outcome of every disagreement. Your silence challenges that narrative completely. It signals that you may no longer accept the role they assigned to you. Without your reactions, they lose the emotional resistance they once pushed against. They have nothing left to manipulate, no conflict to exploit, and no emotional proof that they still occupy the center of your world. This absence creates deep restlessness. They may replay old conversations repeatedly, searching for clues they overlooked. They may begin wondering whether someone new has entered your life or whether something fundamentally changed inside you. Even if they have not contacted you, they may already be looking for opportunities to regain influence. The silence becomes far louder in their mind because they no longer know what is happening on your side. That uncertainty removes the illusion that they can predict or control your behavior. For someone who depended on always feeling central to your life, becoming an outsider is incredibly unsettling. Their emotions often swing rapidly between confidence and insecurity, certainty and suspicion, entitlement and anxiety. All of that internal instability is triggered by one simple fact. You are no longer participating in the cycle they created. Although it may appear from the outside that nothing is happening while both people remain silent, the narcissist often begins moving through a familiar pattern of behaviors designed to restore control. One of the most common responses is attempting to fill the void left by your absence through tactics such as hoovering, baiting, or creating conflict through other people. These are rarely impulsive decisions. They are strategies aimed at rebuilding the influence they feel slipping away. Hoovering usually begins when they realize your silence is lasting much longer than expected. Initially, they assume you will return because that has happened before. But when days continue passing without a response, urgency begins replacing confidence. They may suddenly send a kind message, remind you of a happy memory, mention a personal crisis, or present themselves as someone who has finally changed. They might appear unusually thoughtful, apologetic, or emotionally vulnerable. Their approach often changes depending on what they believe will be most effective. The purpose, however, is usually not genuine emotional growth. It is to restore the dynamic where they once held control. If those softer attempts fail, or if reaching out with vulnerability feels too risky for them, They often move toward baiting instead. Rather than trying to pull you back with warmth or affection, they attempt to provoke an emotional reaction through irritation, jealousy, confusion, or indirect conflict. The specific method may change, but the objective remains the same. They are searching for any sign that your silence can still be broken because, to them, even a negative reaction feels better than no reaction at all. Baiting is meant to pull you back into an emotional exchange. It does not matter whether your reaction is anger, sadness, jealousy, or frustration. To the narcissist, any emotional response confirms that they still occupy space in your mind. They may post something on social media designed to make you jealous, send a cold or insulting message to provoke an argument, or manufacture unnecessary conflict simply to force you into responding. The emotion itself is not what matters. What matters is knowing they were able to trigger it. Your silence removes the sense of influence they once relied upon, so baiting becomes an attempt to reopen the emotional wound, hoping you react just enough to prove they still have access to you. If provoking you directly does not work, they often move to another strategy known as triangulation. This involves intentionally bringing another person into the situation, whether it is a former partner, a new relationship, a friend, or even a family member. The purpose is rarely genuine connection. Instead, they use that person to rebuild a sense of power. They may proudly display a new romance, suggest that someone else appreciates them more than you ever did, or portray themselves as the one who has been abandoned while exaggerating your silence. Their goal is to make you question yourself, feel replaced, or believe your position in their life has been taken by someone else. They want you to feel insecure enough to compete for attention or prove your worth once again. None of these behaviors should be mistaken for love or genuine attachment. They reveal dependence rather than affection. The narcissist depends heavily on outside validation to maintain their identity, and when one source disappears, they immediately search for another way to fill the gap. Hoovering, baiting, and triangulation are all different methods of trying to restore psychological control rather than rebuild an emotionally healthy relationship. Their actions are driven by fear, entitlement, and a wounded ego, all activated by the simple fact that you stopped participating in the cycle. As the silence continues, something much deeper begins unfolding beneath the surface. While you may gradually experience the quiet as a pathway toward peace and emotional freedom, the narcissist experiences it very differently. To them, your silence does not represent calm, it represents lost control. Because their sense of identity depends so heavily on the reactions of other people, especially those they once influenced, your absence creates an internal alarm. This is an important distinction to understand. The peace you are beginning to feel is often experienced by them as growing panic. Narcissists frequently depend on constant emotional stimulation. Whether that attention comes through admiration, arguments, praise, conflict, or drama, they often need to feel central in someone else's emotional world. The moment you stop providing that energy, the foundation supporting their inflated self-image begins to weaken. Without regular feedback from you, they struggle to regulate their emotions in a healthy way. Your silence removes the reassurance they unconsciously relied upon, creating a chain reaction that becomes increasingly difficult for them to ignore. Initially, they may pretend your silence means nothing. They may act completely unaffected, tell themselves they never cared, or even convince others they feel relieved. However, this confidence is often only a protective mask. As more time passes, the quiet becomes impossible to dismiss. Without your attention reinforcing their self-image, feelings of insignificance slowly begin surfacing. Those emotions are especially painful because they touch one of their deepest fears, becoming ordinary, unnoticed, or emotionally irrelevant. While you are slowly rebuilding yourself, they are struggling with an emptiness that threatens the identity they carefully constructed. Your nervous system begins settling after living through constant unpredictability. The emotional fog that once clouded your thinking starts clearing. You gradually recognize your own value again and reconnect with the parts of yourself that had been pushed aside simply to survive the relationship. What becomes healing for you becomes increasingly destabilizing for them. As the silence stretches on, the difference between your experiences becomes even more obvious. They may spend more time replaying old conversations, imagining countless scenarios, or inventing explanations for why you no longer respond. The uncertainty continues bothering them because they no longer have access to your emotional world. Often, what they miss is not the relationship itself, but the reflection of themselves they once saw through your reactions. Your silence restores your identity while quietly exposing the instability of theirs. Eventually, the silence begins changing you in ways that feel subtle at first but become impossible to ignore. Your nervous system, which spent so much time preparing for the next criticism, manipulation, or emotional explosion, finally has an opportunity to slow down. Living in a narcissistic relationship often creates a constant state of hypervigilance. You become conditioned to monitor every mood, every facial expression, every shift in tone, always trying to prevent the next conflict before it begins. Over time, your body starts treating emotional instability as something normal. Because of that conditioning, the early stages of silence often feel surprisingly uncomfortable. Instead of immediate relief, you may feel restless, anxious, or strangely unsettled. The absence of conflict can even feel unfamiliar enough that your mind interprets it as another warning sign. That reaction does not mean you are weak or making the wrong decision. It simply reflects how deeply your nervous system adapted to surviving constant emotional stress. Gradually, though, everything begins changing. Your thoughts become clearer because they are no longer consumed by trying to predict someone else's behavior. You notice that you can make decisions without fear of triggering another emotional storm. Your sleep becomes more restful. Moments of genuine peace begin appearing again, sometimes for the first time in years. This is your nervous system recognizing that it no longer has to remain in survival mode every moment of the day. This is where true healing begins. It is a kind of healing that does not require an apology, an explanation, or closure from the person who hurt you. You begin reclaiming emotional energy that was once spent managing their emotions instead of your own. You rediscover your ability to think independently, trust your instincts, experience your own feelings without having them dismissed or manipulated, and make choices based on your own values rather than constantly trying to avoid conflict, As weeks become months, your silence evolves from a fragile boundary into something much stronger. The narcissist may still attempt occasional contact. They may send subtle messages, make indirect comments through mutual friends, or look for opportunities to re-enter your life. But something inside you has changed. The words that once kept you awake at night no longer carry the same emotional weight. Their attempts to pull you back into old patterns begin sounding like distant echoes instead of urgent demands. Eventually, you realize you no longer feel compelled to analyze every message, question every motive, or predict every move they might make. The mystery that once consumed your thoughts loses its power because your attention has shifted toward rebuilding your own future. Instead of trying to solve them, you are finally investing your energy in yourself. That is when you understand what the silence truly accomplished. It cut off the emotional cycle that once kept you trapped while creating space for your own recovery. The collapse you feared in the beginning was never your own. It was the collapse of the control they once held over your life. What once felt like unbearable silence becomes the sound of emotional freedom. The world did not fall apart when the conversations ended. In many ways, that was the moment your real life finally began.